Hello guys, David Vose back again. Man, I tell ya, I couldn't believe that I broke my phone again, or something happened to it. I don't know what happened to it. It just went white. As I told you, and I had to take it back down, and I thought I'd lost the phone. Well, I was praying and trying not to, think too much about it and just put it in the Lord's hands, and called the next morning, and the guy said, yeah, bring it on down and I'll fix it for free. So I thought, thank you, Lord. And I drove down the next day, and he had to replace it, the screen, which comes with the whole kind of the frame, and there's stuff. It's part of the guts or it's different. I thought they scraped the glass off, but anyway, they put a whole new thing on. And I remember when I got it, he said, do you want the original kind that goes with this AT&T phone or whatever, or Samsung? Or do you want an aftermarket? Well, I should have gotten I'm really thinking I probably should have given him another $100 for the Samsung, because I think that's why that went out, is because the aftermarket stuff is no good. So the only reason I didn't do it is because I'd already ordered that, and I didn't have any more money. It was $390 just for the aftermarket screen. The one that was from Samsung, the legit one, was like $500 or something. I don't remember the cost, but it was a lot of money, and I just didn't have it. So anyway, everything's working good. Hope you're having a wonderful day. A lot of good things are going on, and been doing a lot of thinking over the last couple of days. But that's why I didn't get to do a video yesterday. I had to go into town, spend all day messing around. But I've been really wanting to do this video. Friends, I don't know how this video is going to turn out, because I just turned this on. But I got some thoughts going on in my head that I want to share with you. I don't know how I'm going to be able to express it in the best of ways. I don't know how it's going to turn out, this whole story, because, well, we usually just turn it on and start talking, and it usually comes out pretty good. But it's just that this information is so explosive. It will change everything we know about our world if this could get out. If the information I'm about to tell you could get out to many, many people, maybe, I suppose it doesn't have to get out to millions, but to the right people that can share it. And then, I know from the past history that people will get this information and they'll run with it. They'll try to kind of make it their own, but at least the information will get out. I'm very aware that the only thing we're trying to do right now is get this information out. I was asking AI so many provocative and amazing questions that they'd never heard of before, trying to get them to show me historical proofs, and I need documentation for some of the stuff I want to tell you today. And I can tell that AI really doesn't seem to know the information I'm asking. It never put all this together like that. And the way I'm asking the questions, I feel as though it's triggering something in the algorithms on the AI, to where they are like, somehow, I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but it feels like they're taking note of what I'm investigating here, because they sent me a pop-up thing, came up and said, be the first one to take part in this experiment, or whatever they're calling it, this program or whatever they have, that they're going to test out their new AI on certain individuals or something. I don't know. They didn't say all that. What they actually said is, you will be the first one. We've chosen you to be the first one to take this experimental test run of our AI system. And I guess they're just trying to get somebody that asks some pertinent questions, and just to kind of test the system, because they noticed that I was asking the most pertinent questions of everybody on here. Now, I could be wrong, and they just said that I'd be the first one, and they sent that out to a whole bunch of other people, and they got that same offer. So I don't know if I'm just one of a group of individuals that got on this test run of AI, or if I'm the first, as they claimed when they sent it to me. Anyway, I'm digging deep into a wide range of things and trying to find some answers that I feel must be there and hidden somewhere. So I recently found out about an organization, a Masonic organization that was prevalent in the United States around the time of the Civil War, called the KGC. And the KGC means the Knights of the Golden Circle. And it's important. Wait till you get a load of this information about the Knights of the Golden Circle. It'll blow your mind. They were basically a group of Masons. In doing this research, I'm finding more clarity on exactly what happened with these Masons. Number one, who made the Templars? Well, St. Bernard de Clairvaux. Okay, and I'd known that for a while, and I had been noticing his name, Vaux, which is certainly the old French way of saying Vax or Vos, which is also where we get the word valley, and Waldo, Peter Waldo, and Valdez. All these different words goes back to this word valley. And it seems to me it is pertinent because the story is missing. We don't know what happened to Mary Magdalene's family and Jesus' son and his daughters and so forth. But it's funny that we only know about, most people have heard about Sarah, which is a child of Mary Magdalene. She had a daughter named Sarah. I don't know if there is any record of the son's name, if they had any males in their union. There's one thing I found, but I'm not sure that I believe it. It's not necessarily scripture, but there's one place where there were two sons from Mary Magdalene and Jesus, but one was Joseph and one was Ephraim. So I think that would be at best symbolic. But Sarah is pretty well documented, and the reason that's important is because there's a certain bloodline in Europe that only traces their lineage through the female line. So one of the main lines they go back to is the Capetian line. Later on, after the Capetian dynasty, they called it the Valois, which again is the valley. It's very interesting that this word valley, spelled so many different ways, Valois, Valley, Waldo, Vaux, and then through England to Boston, Vose, because the X would be like a S on the end. It's just the way people pronounce things. And if you look at why would there be an L, Valley, in Vos? Because Valois is got the L's, but they didn't pronounce the L's in some places, so it would be just Voies, But this royal bloodline that the legends say, and it's a very concrete legend, just like any other of the ancient kingdoms had, like Rome had their ancestors going back to Hercules and people that were from the gods, and just about every country has this. But the legends of the Languedoc, or the lower France area down by the Mediterranean, where Mary Magdalene and Martha and Lazarus and a boat with 72 landed in Marseille. Well, most people would read that because they're not understanding all the little symbols or words in these parables or legends or whatever they are. They would miss it. But the 72, of course, is the Sanhedrin that Jesus chose, called the elders. Obviously, the fact that they arrived in France means that they set up the kingdom of Christ there. And this is confirmed by so many other things. The entire whole Knights of the Holy Grail and the Knights of St. John protecting the... this goes back, as I said, to when Jesus was on the cross and he looked at John the elder. Why was he called the elder? Because there were two Johns. It was the Apostle John, who died fairly early, and then there was another John. Well, which one is he? Oh, he's the elder. Well, who's older than the Apostle John? Would have been John the Baptist. So this is why he's called the presbyter, or the elder. And of course, John was beheaded, but there's indication in our Bible even where it says that some had thought John had been raised from the dead. In the early Christian centuries, this rumor was going around, the Bible tells us. But apocryphal sources say that this was probably John the Baptist, who had been raised from the dead. And he went with Mary, and they ended up in Marseille, France. So Lazarus took Mary, her children, to Gaul. Jesus' mother, Mary, they say, history says, these legends say she settled in Ephesus in Greece, which is interesting because that's exactly where John goes to after he gets out of this Isle of Patmos. He's released and he's like over 100 years old, and he goes, and remember, he's to protect this lady, the mother of the Lord Jesus. So she must have ended up there in Greece, where she supposedly died. Mary Magdalene, though, was said to have died in France. And Lazarus himself died in Marseille, where he founded a church. But Sarah, which was their daughter, and some say Joseph, they grew up in France. Sarah and Joseph and perhaps another son. They married and had children. Their offspring married. They had children. And they had a royal lineage of children. And the legend that goes along with that is the Merovingian dynasty, which says that somebody married a royal princess. This is kind of something that goes through all the legends. And the union of that royal princess produces Percival, which is in all the romance novels of that time, talking about this Snow White, or this princess that was being the wicked witch was trying to kill her. Well, obviously this witch has got a black robe, so it's some other kind of wise order of priests that were trying to get rid of this Christ and the children of Christ, and trying to put her to sleep. And in fact, the history has ignored this lineage until Dan Brown's book and a couple other people lately that's been talking about it. Nobody's even understood any of this. But it's the reason why all over the world to this day, everybody's got names. They name their children James or Frank or David or Charles or, different, all these, Robert. All of these names were ancestral names going back to Mary Magdalene. And, it's just crazy. I was thinking about this the other day. My dad is David Charles Vose. And his brother is Frank. French, the Franks, and Charlemagne, Charles, and all of these names. And I was thinking to myself, why would my grandmother, when she had 2 boys and 2 girls, why would she say, honey, we're going to have to name the first one Frank, and I forget his middle name, which is something like James or something, I don't remember, it was Henry, but another one of these names. And the second kid will name David Charles. Like, these are the most important names going back through this bloodline. Now, it could have been coincidence. And maybe my grandpa, which I didn't know him, and I have very little knowledge of him, other than when I was born, he died, like that week or that day, because he was in the hospital dying of cancer, and they brought me to the hospital window outside. I couldn't go in because it was a cancer ward or something, but they held me up outside the window so that my grandpa could see me before he died, which is interesting because I don't know that he cared. I mean, I never heard about my grandpa. Only thing I ever heard about my grandpa is that Grandma used to say they would argue and argue. Argue. It's all he wants to do is argue. That's what I used to hear my brothers say. So I don't know if they argued a lot or whether it was Grandma's arguing or Grandpa was the arguer. I don't know. But he was a sawmill worker. He cut trees. He felled the largest sugar pine in California with one of those saws that you get on one end and pull, and somebody gets on the other end and pulls. But he worked in the sawmills in the lumber industry and picked fruit in the summer. And all his children, my uncle Frank and my dad and their 2 sisters, they made them go out and work in the thing. So they were poor people, and they didn't think much about history. I don't think they knew a lick about history, or, it's hard to believe that they knew that it was imperative that they name their children after their ancestors over and over and over again for hundreds of years. And this is something that apparently everyone did. Because if you go back 50 years or something and ask about somebody's name, it's always going to be one of these names. Anne or Anna or David or Mary or Lisa or Bernard, or all these very specific names that goes back to all these royal bloodlines. So most of us are somewhere along the line going back to these bloodlines. But there does seem to be 2 of note. A good line and a bad line, shall we say. But somehow or another, history has sealed it all up in a royal novel, like a mystery, King Arthur and the Round Table. And most people don't realize, but this whole story of King Arthur and the Round Table and the mystical city where they was like this paradise on earth that they were trying to, this castle, that they were establishing, and this holy bloodline of this princess and the prince that was born that had to pull out the sword of truth. All of these stories literally stem from France and the tales of Mary Magdalene. She's the princess. And so we're trying to find who the princess will give birth to one day, who will then be awakened, and they'll be forever and ever, and they live forever and ever in happiness, So this is the end of the story, right? But somehow or another, there was this other line that married into Charlemagne's line that ended up warring. These Visigoths and these Germans were constantly always warring against this other line. Finally, the Merovingian line, which comes from this legend, that supposedly defeated the Visigoths, or the Scandinavian hordes, and officially created this holy bloodline that then goes down through these Carpathian and the Valois line and various other lines like Sinclair and so forth down through the ages. And we're going to find that, well, there's some interesting things that we're going to find out here. I think it was Clodius, who was the son of Merovic, started the Merovingian line. But this legend is that his wife encountered a quintar. And this quintar beast from the sea had relations with his wife, and it produced this holy bloodline. So their children somehow were from this woman riding this quintar. Now, again, it gets lost in translation because quin means 5, and tar is this word we have for Taurus, the bull. So it is a 5-horned bull. Now, again, people don't understand astrology, so they don't understand the context of this parable or this legend, which is why they don't understand the book of Revelation, which is also about astrology. But the bull is Taurus. And, of course, the bull only has 2 horns, we think. But here we have 5. Why? Because, remember the beast that had 5 horns that fell? One is, the other's yet to come. Well, this was the horn that was, but 5 had already fallen. That was the beast that this line came from. And get this. This bull beast kind of sounds like the beast in Revelation, but it's a bull. And Taurus is a bull. But the beast that's in the sea, that would be Saturn. Or, down there in the bottom of the wheel. So if you look at the bottom of the wheel, you see a goat with a fishtail for Capricorn. Well, Saturn is this beast, this devil, and they, in astrology, have him being exemplified down there in the bottom of the wheel, but he's again glorified in Taurus in this symbol because it's a quintar. So it's half a bull and its body is that of this sea beast. So it is the sea beast. It's just that his head is the bull. He's a quintar. And so it's the adoration of Saturn in Taurus, the bull. But somehow or another, there's a woman that goes down. In the stories of the Sumerians and so forth, they say that it's Ishtar or it's Inanna or something. She goes down into hell and she steals the May or the law or the right to reign from Yahweh. See, because Yahweh is this Saturn. In Hebrew, he's Yahweh. But Yahweh is being depicted in the sky. And this is why Orion's got the bow and he's trying to get the bull's eye and defeat the beast. But don't worry, this Mary Magdalene's got the reins and she's riding it. She's got control of it. But it does seem to be some kind of a mixture of the bloodlines in some kind of crazy way. And this bull came up out of the sea. It's really the same story as Revelation chapter 13. I saw a beast coming out of the sea. And there's a woman riding the beast. And the woman, of course, if you look in the sky, you see Taurus. And on the shoulders of Taurus, you see the 7 sisters of the Pleiades. And there are 7 young maidens. But the main woman there is literally Mary Magdalene riding the beast, which is also talked about in other legends and countries from the very beginning, because it was always written down in the sky, like Ishtar or Inanna or Astarte, or as the Hebrews celebrate her, Queen Esther, on the day of Purim or Easter time. Yeah. So this legend while it's speaking specifically of this bloodline of the Merovingian line, it's also telling us that it was destiny, and it is the royal line of some particular princess, which the Templars and the Cathars who were from that area always said in their rituals, and the Knights of St. John and all their secrets, was that they went back to Mary Magdalene, and they were descendants of it, and they were there to protect the Virgin Mother. John himself took her to Ephesus to protect her until she either died or was translated off this earth in some glorious rapture. We know that the story says that Mary Magdalene spent 30 years preaching from a cave. People would make pilgrimages there and learn from her, and she was this apostle to the apostles, and she lived around Marseille. And this area then created a capital, which was Montpellier, which is very important to the founding fathers, as we've talked about. And if you come over here to America or anywhere else in Europe or anywhere else in the world where these colonizers went, every time they'd go anywhere, they named everything Mary and John and all these things. Even this river here, Gia River, where they apparently landed and named everything, all the cities and towns after the apostles and Mary and John. They went up the Gia River all the way to where I'm at. And at the very end of that river, and most people don't know this because it suddenly changes the name. It's exactly the same river, but they changed the name of it. It's no longer the Gia. Some other, I forget the name. But you keep following it, and another few more miles under this other name, and you come out to this big salt lake, where originally on the maps you see a lake. And there is still a lake there, but it's very small. But it used to be bigger, and it's like a salt flat now. But there's still a lake, and around at the other end of that lake, the very far end of it, is a little town in New Mexico called Mary Magdalene. Or I think it's called Magdalena is the town. So you find these markers everywhere, all the way along, as if there's some mysterious journey that they took or somebody's taken, and there's a lot of mysteries in this. So, but this royal bloodline seems to have continued, though under legends for a while. And it was kind of, for about 400 years, nobody really knew it was being pushed aside because of the Holy Roman Empire and all the things that was going on. It seemed like they were trying to hide it. Well, let me correct that. They knew while it was going on. Of course, they knew who they were, and the other people knew who they were because they were trying to kill them. That's why they had the Waldensian Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition. They were trying to get rid of the bloodline of Christ. So they knew. But in history, since that time, they have pushed it aside and hidden these mysteries, and all we now have is the legends. But around the 5th century, somehow or other, this royal bloodline was intermarried with the Frank bloodline from the Franks. And that was what made the Merovingian dynasty. From there, it continued on through the Carolingian dynasty, which again is so everywhere. This is Charles, or Carl, right? Caroline. And so when they got to America, they called the Carolinas, right? It's everywhere you look is these inferences. They disposed the Merovingian line, and we go down to William the Conqueror of England. We go down to Great Britain, Ireland, France, and Germany, where all certain lineal descendants of this line ended up. But as we go down, there's lots of wars, and a battle almost for the throne of the world. And eventually, France becomes the most powerful country in Europe and in the world, basically. And it's like, I don't know why people don't seem to understand this. We think of the past as just all Roman or Holy Roman or Catholic or maybe Germanic or even British. But few people realize that the French were really the ruling power for a long time. They ended up by the 15th century, we've got this King Louis, and we've got France, who then acknowledge, or in their official records begin to state, that they are from Mary Magdalene. That's the source of the French royal bloodline. King Charlemagne ended up ruling up in Habsburg, recognized the royal descent of that line back to Mary Magdalene. Now, why would they do that? Why isn't AI saying, oh, that's kind of proof then that it was, oh, well, it's just a legend. Well, everything's just a legend. I don't know. To be fair, I guess when they say Rome came from a god, they poo-poo it too. But I think they're more apt to understand that this, as we've said, this lineage back to a god doesn't necessarily mean some off-planetary extraterrestrial being or slanty-eyed aliens, but it really has to do with going back to the patriarchs and to Noah and their bloodlines. But they ended up in the line of the Habsburg, Lorraine, the Plantard. There's quite a few other different lines, even in Britain, and this is probably where it went primarily right after France, with the Sinclair, the Stuarts. And that's a whole nother rabbit hole that we might go down one time when you get to the Stuart line, because a lot of people think that's the royal bloodline. And interestingly, Princess Diana was from the Stuart line. There was even some speculation that Donald Trump had an affair with her or something. And the whole Harry Potter book is literally about Princess Diana and Harry, King Harry, or Prince Harry, and the other kid. I forget his name right now. But it's all about that. There is something about that. I mean, it seems that Princess Diana was murdered on an altar inside of a tunnel. And this is all documented, but that's something else that we can get into another time. The line of Trump, his grandmother, I think, was the line, her last name was Christ. And I'm pretty sure that that was another line of the Stuart line, or going back to the Merovingian line. But of course, Donald Trump and any lineal descendant of these royal bloodlines, they have multiple lineal descents. And so Trump could probably claim his line, as well as the kings and queens of England stuff. They can trace their lines back to Jesus and back to the line of the Antichrist, which we'll talk about at another time. What this means is that there's only one royal bloodline, and that's why the Bible says the scepter will not depart from Judah until he who comes who has the legal right. So there's one who has the legal right, but in the meantime, the scepter will remain with Judah. Well, Christ has got the legal right, but Jesus came from the line of David, who has some ancestry back to Judah, but also some back to Joseph and Ephraim, which is why, perhaps is why the legend says that was the name of his son, because they want you to understand that it's of the lineage of Joseph. Interesting, Joseph Smith. And we always hear about Chief Joseph of the natives. So there was a native tribe that had this name, Joseph, that lived in America too. But that's another little side note. We're going to get into who these KGC people were. We're going to get into these Native American individuals. And we're going to tell you down the road here, as we probably in the next video, because we're already halfway through this one. But we're going to talk about this, I don't know, it's like a temple or a big castle. I don't know exactly what the name of it would be. It was more of a place where they would go to pray, basically. So I guess it's a temple, but there was also cemeteries and so forth. But it was where the Knights Templars, where this Saint Bernard de Clairvaux started the Templars, and they built this huge, I guess almost like their little central headquarters, where they were meditating and the knights would meet, and where the people that were important in their families were buried. And it was just like it was a part of their way of life that this particular lineage from Mary Magdalene was carrying on. It was very important, and it was supposed to have been built in, like, I don't know the exact date. I think it might have been like 1111, which is interesting. But right around the 11th century, supposedly it was built in France. And yet we find this building in Florida, southern Florida near Miami, where you'll find this cloister. I think it's called the cloister. And there's some fascinating information I want to share with you about this. Supposedly, it is the very temple that the Templars made in France in 1111, the 12th century. But there it is in Florida. They supposedly took it down stone by stone and floated it over here and rebuilt it. But it was so big they couldn't put it in one place, so half of it is in the Bahamas. And so we're going to get into the Bahamas, Cuba, the cube, the golden circle, their plans, what they had, what this has to do with Joseph Smith, who was initiated into the York Rite because there wasn't any Scottish Rite up in that area. But Joseph Smith literally was initiated into the York Rite, 33rd degree Mason, by Master Jonas, who was, according to AI, not only a Master Mason of the 33rd degree, initiating these individuals into this order in Illinois when Joseph Smith was there. But he was also involved in the KGC, which is the Knights of the Golden Circle, which had this illustrious plan. We're going to talk about some things that you've never heard before in your life. The president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, go look at a picture of him, and then go look at President Lincoln. They lived, almost born and died the same days. They were in the same, they looked identical. President Lincoln looks identical to Jefferson Davis. And there's a conspiracy theory saying that they're the same person acting. It was an act, and the same person played this out. But I'm going to show you proof that the Masons create different organizations, and it's all run by the same organization. And the people that were running the Confederate side of the war, it was the guy's brother who was running it that was running the Union side. And it was all literally a scam. And there's this great big Confederacy treasure that we're going to talk about that Jefferson Davis took off with. And when they found him, he'd already handed it off to all these people, and they took it someplace. And this is a mystery to this day about where all this gold came from and why they had all this gold. Well, this gold seems to be some kind of a treasure, possibly the Templar treasure, since we've got the temple that the Templars made in Florida. And there's a lot of information we've just never been told about these early days, about Florida and Texas and the southern states. The Confederate Army and the southern United States that split from the northern was run primarily by the Knights of the Golden Circle. And it was always apparently opposed to the Republicans. So it was like the Democrats against the Republicans, really, is what it really was. And what these Southern Democrats really were these Knights of the Golden Circle that was trying to, for the slave owners, the elite down there that had all these slaves, they were trying to make a confederacy where they would have this great big spiritual paradise on earth, centered in Cuba. All the way along the Gulf, they would have Mexico and Cuba and Florida and Texas. Now, they were originally called the Lone Star. Their little secret society was the Lone Star Society. That's what sort of started taking over Florida and Texas and some of the southern states. Well, they were literally also being organized and run by the Masons. There were two factions. And I don't think they were arguing. I mean, the people were, but at the top, it was all run by this Jewish Illuminati from Bavaria. The guy that was running the bottom side was David Benjamin, and another guy named Moses Levi that had Florida. He had 100,000 acres in Florida, and he had this, I guess was like a farm or an estate or ewe-lease. And that's from the word Clovis. Clovis or Ulvis or Ulvi or something is a derivation of Clovis, which was one of the ancestors or the descendants or in the lineage of Mary Magdalene. Remember, this huge temple that you can go and look it up on your internet. It's called the Cloister of St. Bernard de Clairvaux, who is the guy who started the Templars, of the lineage of this bloodline back to the Knights of St. John and all the way back to Mary Magdalene. And so this Vaux is the old French way of saying this name, which in other languages is Valley or Percival or Peter Waldo. But here he is, Clairvaux. Clair in that language was clear or clear and bright. So it was the Clear Valley. So he was Bernard of the Clear Valley. Now, if you look up on AI and ask AI what this valley is, that Peter Waldo and, the Valensians or the Valdensians that were persecuted in the Inquisition and all of these names, Valois, the royal bloodline, they say that the Waldensians were said to have lived in the valleys, usually around the Rhine and the Rhone, which is also peculiar that both of those rivers are two different rivers, but they seem to run into each other. And one starts at the bottom all the way down to Marseille, and you keep going up, and you run into the Rhine, which goes through the Swiss Alps and all the way up to the northern area. But both of these were known for being this broad, huge valley, like Piedmont. You see this mountain in some of the movies, and it's in all of the symbolisms in the movie industry and stuff like this, Mount Piedmont. And at the base was the Great Valley. And the Alps, they were called the Albigensians. But all of this area was peopled by Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ's descendants in the valleys of Piedmont, or mountain, of this royal bloodline. This is why Peter Waldo is called Peter, a symbol, again, of Pope. So it was kind of like the lineal descendant back to Mary Magdalene, who was their real papa, real Pope. And so they continued down to this time when they were being run out in the Inquisition in the 1100s. The Waldensians were murdered and crucified. So there was wars and many wars, and this is also where we get Catholics that are Franciscan and Dominican. The Dominicans were coming in and murdering everyone, but the ones that were Catholics that were living in France, they liked the Cathars. They liked the people of France, and they didn't want to murder them, so they started becoming Cathars. This is why they really had to murder them all, because they were winning over the Catholics in the area. And so the Catholics then didn't want to change their religion, so they started another movement. So the Catholic Church almost split in two, the Dominican Catholics and the Franciscan. And the Franciscans are the ones that went to America. They got out of there in the Inquisition. They were really not really Catholics anymore. I mean, they still believe in Jesus and stuff, but they were sympathetic with Mary. So this is why they came over being Catholics and named everything Mary here too. The Franciscan individuals from France were the Catholics that were sympathetic with the French. And so this is why we have a lot of Franciscan priests and stuff and friars and so forth in America. And California is all Spanish architecture, which was originally the way they lived in France. The architecture of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. It was very mixed and had become more or less one with the Islamic peoples that were there in those places too. Because Spain, when the Inquisition took off, had been under the rule of the Moors, Morocco or Africa, and they were Islamic, and their major city was Timbuktu down in Africa. So the Muslims people had control of Spain, and they also were very sympathetic with the Languedoc and the Septimania. These individuals, province is what it was also called for a while, like providential, but they had an alliance. The descendants of Christ had an alliance with Christians that you would say were Sephardic Jews that had an alliance with Christians and Muslims, and they got along and everything was wonderful. It was the Catholics that were trying to stop them and murder them all. So, Clear Valley, Bernard of the Clear Valley, is one of the ways they would speak of their ancestral home of the Great Valley. And Avalon, which was in France, which is in the story of King Arthur and the Round Table. Avalon was the great heavenly city. Now, we get to Cuba, and the capital of that is Havana, which sounds a little bit like heaven. And Cuba sounds a little bit like the cube. And whenever you're talking about Masons, they're always squaring the cube. So they have the golden circle, and in the middle of the golden circle is the cube. There is so much we're going to go into about this down the road. I don't want to get into it much more here in this video. But if you look it up on AI, they say, well, these names, Cuba and Havana, have nothing to do with Spain. This is some Aboriginal tribe, some indigenous tribe that was there already. They named that city or that area Cuba, and it's the etymology of this is some indigenous Native American language. And we don't know what these words mean, Havana and Cuba. Really? Are you kidding me? You see, this is where it gets into these Indians that lived in this area, Micmac, and we talked about those in another video preceding this, and the Algonquin and stuff. They were 7-8 feet tall, and some say they looked white. If you look on the Indian head nickel from yesteryear, I don't even know if you can find one of these Indian head nickels anymore. But if you look at the Indian that they display prominently on the nickel, he's got this big Roman nose. And he's also got like braids. And it's funny because if you look at President Washington on the quarter and look at the Indian on the nickel, they literally are the same person. They got the same nose. And it is kind of symbolic of saying that the original people there in the eastern coast down to Florida up to New England and all of that area were people that came over way back in 1200 and had already settled this area, and they had Chilago as their capital. The Micmac and the Algonquins and this other tribe, I can't think of, that there were several of these groups, but they're all this particular 7-8 foot tall white people with this big nose. They weren't the same as the Native Americans. They had a written language, and their language looked like some kind of a Greek-looking Egyptian letters. Some say it's Coptic Hebrew or Hebrew Reformed Egyptian. What Joseph Smith said he found in the copper plates or brass plates or whatever he found, he said it was Reformed Egyptian. Well, it's exactly what these natives would write. The Native Americans didn't have this writing. They didn't have this written language like this, apparently. I think, maybe they did, but it certainly was the same language as this. They weren't the same peoples. They didn't identify with these other Native Americans. And they were much taller, and they did trade with the native peoples, but they were different. In fact, they were already here when some of the other people came over on the Mayflower, and they used them to communicate with the natives. And they more aligned themselves with the Europeans that were coming over than they did with the natives. They didn't just live in villages and teepees. They had cities and palisades, and I believe there is very little proof now, because it kind of scuttlebutted all of this, but it looks like these natives that are called the Algonquin and so forth, and Micmac clear down to Florida, they had this trade route from Mexico and the whole Gulf. It was a huge, I mean, there were 100,000, they estimate over 100,000 of these native Algonquin Micmac individuals in the east coast of America, and their main capital was Cuba, and then they traded with Guatemala too, and all of Mexico. This was some grand kingdom that originally some Sephardic Jews, and they were trying to rebuild the Jerusalem, or the New Jerusalem, and they had this whole thing going on here. It ties in something to do with things that Joseph Smith was talking about and so forth. But Cuba was evidently like the center of this golden circle that they were going to rule. And they were going to try to rise up and defeat the northern part of the United States, and then all the United States would be part of the circle. But they had a certain plan. In the Civil War, they had this plan that they were going to go up into Illinois and take over the Midwest of the United States as well. And then they would kind of be surrounding the Northern Union of the United States of America. And they would eventually take over, and the Knights of the Golden Circle will then rule the world, and the Great Temple would be built somewhere in the Bahamas or Cuba, because you see, right off of Cuba, real close, I mean, the Bahamas are right off of Cuba, just, I don't know, a couple of miles out there in the water. I don't know exactly how far, but it's, if you look on the map, it's almost a little island of Cuba. Isn't it interesting that when the Moses Levy's son, David Levy, when the Confederate Army lost, they started running. They were taking the gold. Nobody knows where this treasure, the Templar treasure, went. But we do know, we could trace it right up to a place where they had taken it on trains all the way down to this Yulee's plantation. There was another one called Gamble's or something, but there was these big plantations, and Yulee's plantation was in southern Florida, and it was run by this Moses Levy and his son David Levy, and David Levy received all of this treasure. That's where they were taking it, on train cars down there to this Yulee's plantation. So the Union Army was sending all kinds of units and dogs and hounds to try and get this gold before it got out somewhere and they hid it. And they traced it all the way to Florida, but just as they were getting there to nab the gold, this David Levy, by the way, the press secretary's name is Levy, and she's complaining about Goldberg trying to sabotage the Trump administration. Well, they're on both sides, guys. Trump's press secretary is Levy. I digress. But David Levy took off with the gold and went to the Bahamas. Well, why is that important? Didn't he have to go somewhere, and that's a likely spot to get some rest and get a bite to eat? Well, we don't really know where he went from there, but what we do know is that the second in command of the Confederate Army was a guy named Judah Benjamin. And he probably had some of the money as well. They kind of split it up among them, and he took off and went to the Bahamas. Well, from there, after he left the Bahamas, he went to Britain again and became a lawyer working for Her Majesty in Her Majesty's court. So, he wasn't prosecuted or anything. It wasn't like hunted down. This was all programmed. They had this all planned. And he spent his life there in Britain, and nobody says that there's some kind of proof that he had a whole bunch of trillions of dollars or anything like this. He just worked as a lawyer. So we're not sure where the money went. But both these guys, they all end up in Bahamas. Now, like I said, the Bahamas is just a couple of miles off the coast of Cuba. Well, in this little island where they went, there's the other half of the Templar temple that was originally in Spain, but they supposedly put it on a boat and took it to Florida and built a tower in Miami, and the other half of it, which is so huge, it wasn't this huge monastery or whatever it was so huge you couldn't fit it all in Florida, so they had to build the rest over there in the Bahamas, right off the coast of Cuba, basically in Cuba, in the cube. And their plan was the Golden Circle, and this monastery of the Templars was in some kind of circle, and it was some ancient big stones, and it's magnificent. It's the oldest building in the Western Hemisphere. The oldest building in the Western Hemisphere is in Florida and in Bahamas. And it's supposedly it was originally built in Spain. This boggles my mind. And I'm not sure if it's the truth. And I'm going to try and see if I can find proof that it wasn't taken from Spain and rebuilt here. That would mean that the Templars were started in America, and these native Micmacs and so forth weren't really natives. And there's a lot more going on here with Chilago and different things that we've been talking about that meets the eye, which we'll get into in the next video. I see we're getting down to almost an hour, so I'm going to wrap this up. Friends, there is a conspiracy. Well, it's only a conspiracy because when I tell you guys, you won't believe it and you'll say, that's a conspiracy. Well, I'm going to give you so much proof, maybe some of it anecdotal, but there is so much evidence that some kind of something going on here. And wait till you find out about the KGC and who they were. I mean, the York Rite, the Scottish Rite. Oh, man. Find out about their plans, who was involved in the KGC, and how that relates to the KKK, I know, and even the KFC, Colonel Sanders. It'll blow your mind. But I'm going to go ahead and leave it here, and got other things to do today as well. Going to try and get this uploaded. Wish you guys a happy, wonderful evening of leisure and rest and blessings. And we'll see you guys tomorrow. The Lord will bless you. His grace and His peace will be with you. Have a good one.